people that aren't working or not doing a good job. We're keeping the best people.
This is absolutely the wrong move, and something that I know a lot of parents are panicked about.
They're being terrorized by this administration. They're terrified about their careers. Many are terrified about their safety.
If you claim that we want to protect the government by shutting it down, that absolutely will impact millions and millions and millions of people.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, tariff retaliation. The president at the White House today hosted Ireland's prime minister in anticipation of St. Patrick's Day. He took quite a few questions during that session, many of them revolving around the European Union's decision, of course, Ireland is a part of the European Union, that it will soon impose tariffs on $28 billion worth of U.S. goods. This, while China and Canada announced intentions to impose tariffs on $21 billion of U.S. goods. Those in retaliation to the Trump administration's new 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, as well as other tariffs on China. I know it's hard to keep track of all of it, and if you think it's hard for you to keep track of, just check with Wall Street. Rubio and Russia. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the U.S. is, quote, to have contact, unquote, with Russia today. This 24 hours after Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to a U.S.-backed 30-day ceasefire. What happens next? Well, that depends on the Russians. Is this the beginning of the end for the Department of Education? It might be. Massive layoffs hit that department. Nearly 50% of its workforce, that's 1,300 people, are now out of or soon will be out of a job. While over at the EPA, dozens of regulations today were eliminated, many focused on climate change. I want to start tonight with Nancy Cordes at the White House, Nicole Killian on Capitol Hill. Nancy, a bit awkward in the Oval Office today with the president criticizing the European Union while sitting next to the Irish Prime Minister. Let's take a quick listen to that.
The EU was set up in order to take advantage of the United States.
Including Ireland? Is Ireland taking advantage of the U.S.?
Of course they are. I can't, I have great respect for Ireland and what they did, and they should have done just what they did, but the United States shouldn't have let it happen.
Try to sum it all up. I know that's a big ask, Nancy.
So, Major, Trump's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum coming into the U.S. went into effect today. And so Canada and the European Union are now responding with tariffs of their own. Canada, in particular, is one of the largest suppliers of steel and aluminum to the U.S. So this has a big impact on them. Not surprising that they're going to respond. And so they've been somewhat strategic about the tariffs that they are imposing, both Canada and the EU. They're imposing them on things like bourbon or motorcycles, really quintessential American products that won't hurt Europeans or Canadians that much if the prices end up going up for consumers a little bit. And so now the question is, does President Trump respond to the response with even more tariffs? That's kind of the definition of a trade war. That's what economists worry about. That's what they warn about. Once you start with these tariffs, where does it end as countries continue to try to one-up one another? He didn't say today that he is going to respond, but often these pronouncements come unexpectedly on Truth Social, so we're watching and waiting to hear if he has anything to say.
Nicole, picking up on Nancy's excellent point about the selectivity of some of these tariffs, especially from the EU. Whiskey, that means Tennessee and Kentucky. Motorcycles, that means Wisconsin. And if the tariffs scheduled to go into effect in mid-April happen on soybeans, that's Kansas and Nebraska. Do lawmakers, at least at the moment, have any outsized concerns about what these tariffs and the retaliatory nature that seems to be occurring might have in their states?
Yeah, well, thank you for the geography lesson, and that is really part of it, right? It's the geography. And so, yes, in these states that are more impacted, more sensitive to some of these trade issues, absolutely it is a concern. But those Republican senators who back the president's agenda are trying to give him some runway, trying to give him some time to execute these policies and execute this agenda. You know, in the case, for instance, of Leader Thune, someone who is really kind of keeping an eye on things and has kind of taken the approach that, he hopes that these tariffs are temporary. That is a huge concern that he has, that this is something that could potentially be prolonged. So his point is, as long as it's temporary, I think we can live with it. We have heard that same sentiment from other Republican lawmakers. Certainly Speaker Johnson has made clear he doesn't think that the president's intent here is to start a trade war. That being said, on the other side of the aisle, many Democrats have panned this approach, although some, again, particularly those in border states like Michigan, Senator Alyssa Slotkin, for instance, says, look, I don't have a problem with tariffs, but how you go about them is really critical, and she obviously takes issue with the way the president is handling things right now.
And Nicole, speaking of temporary, that can define the available government funding to keep everything working. That ends Friday. There was an important announcement from the Senate Democratic leader about what Democrats may do or not do about supporting a continuing resolution to avert a government shutdown. What did Leader Schumer have to say?
Well, what he said is the votes aren't there, at least from his side of the aisle, and that is important because the only way that this short-term funding bill can pass is with Democratic support. There's no way Republicans have the numbers they need, about 7 or 8 Democrats to join them to get to that 60-vote threshold in order to pass this government funding. And while we saw one Democrat cross the aisle yesterday over in the House, right now what Leader Schumer is saying is those votes aren't there on his side of the aisle. And so that does create some issues for Leader Thune, who I asked yesterday if he'd be willing to consider an alternative proposal, because Democrats did put up this short-term resolution that would just extend government funding through April. They say they favor this approach because they want to give congressional appropriators more time to hammer out the full appropriation bills, get to a top-line spending number. Appropriators have said they're close, so this would really just buy them a little extra time. But Leader Thune said he feels that this is a smokescreen and that there is just one option on the table, meaning that House Republican bill. I also asked Speaker Johnson yesterday if he would consider that alternative. He, too, said it's not a viable option, and if Democrats don't take this deal, the government could shut down.
Very good on that. Thank you, Nicole. And Nancy, back to you. I mentioned this in the lead-in. There were significant announcements from Environmental Protection Agency about several regulations, many of which started in the Biden administration, now reversed.
Right. These are really significant regulations, Major. We're talking about things like limiting pollution from coal-fired power plants, limiting emissions from cars and trucks. The EPA Administrator, Lee Zeldin, says that he is doing this because they are burdensome on businesses, very costly to manufacturers. He even said that he and the president want to try to rewrite a 2009 really seminal finding by the EPA that planet-warming greenhouse gases are contributing to climate change and are endangering public health. That finding is the underpinning to so many regulations having to do with climate change. Unclear if they'd be able to get away with that in the courts, but it just shows you how far they are interested in going in order to roll back regulations that have been put in place over the past 10 or 20 years.
Nancy Cordes at the White House, Nicole Killian on Capitol Hill. Thank you very, very much. Inflation cooled more than economists expected in February. The Consumer Price Index rose 2.8% from a year earlier. That's still higher than where the Federal Reserve would like it to be, which is around 2%. Grocery prices and the cost of eggs in particular were on the rise. Kelly O'Grady joins us now. Kelly, how should we interpret this inflation data?
So look, Major, this was a generally good report. Remember, we had 4 months of the Consumer Price Index and that overall inflation number ticking up. We got to 3%. So we got a little bit of relief. It still means that prices are rising, just at a slower rate. Now, looking at where we saw some of that pullback, airfare prices were down 4% on the month. Might be because those airlines are seeing slower demand and they're adjusting prices accordingly. We also saw some of the food categories go down. Bacon was a big one, though, of course, eggs. Can't have bacon without eggs. That was on the rise. And then gasoline prices went down 1%. So that's sort of good news for folks who might be driving a little bit more. But I think directionally, we're getting closer to that 2% Federal Reserve target versus further away. But the thing that I want to underscore is this is still a wait and see, because this report did not include most of that tariff impact that we are going to see in the months ahead. So that could really change the picture over the next few months.
And there really are two stories here, Kelly, because the markets responded favorably, at least initially this morning, to this inflation data. Then, as Canada and the EU made its announcements, the markets sagged a bit, and they sort of finished. The Dow was down just a tick. The other two, S&P and NASDAQ, up a little bit. Still a tremendous amount of market uncertainty.
That's right. I think any other normal day or week, not in the tariff environment, you would have seen a much bigger bounce from this inflation report, seeing you go closer to 2% after months of seeing it tick back up. But we are in a very uncertain environment, and I've been talking to a number of businesses, and they're saying there's a bit of paralysis on investing, hiring, laying off. They just don't know what to do, and investors know that, and they see that, and there's also just a lot of uncertainty. The NASDAQ, though, you mentioned, that was up. That was really driven by some of the big tech names because NVIDIA, Meta, AMD, one of the chip makers, they had lost a lot. They had great earnings this season, and a lot of investors said, hey, this is a time to pick these up at a lower valuation. So that's why you saw the NASDAQ bounce.
There's always some bargain hunting going on. Kelly O'Grady, thank you very much. Appreciate it. New revelation on the Trump administration's purge or attempted purge within the Justice Department. What an 18-year Department of Justice veteran has to say about tactics she says employees still within the Department of Justice find intimidating. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. An 18-year veteran of the Department of Justice resigned a few weeks ago. Is now leading a group of former officials helping those inside the department, still there, who are facing demotions, firings, possibly worse. Our Scott McFarland spoke exclusively with this whistleblower.
There are people who have come to us who are being threatened now, and many, many more believe that they could be.
Including by the January 6 rioters or just by supporters of the administration?
By January 6 rioters, by supporters of the administration, by others who have believed the deep state narrative.
Scott McFarland joins me now at the table. Scott, always great to have you. Talk to the audience about what this is all about, the implications, the level of anxiety within the DOJ.
What a sign of the times that a group has had to be stood up to help so many fired, demoted, or reassigned people. That's where we are in the federal government right now, and it's in a particularly sensitive spot in the Department of Justice, which protects America from terrorists, child predators, and violent gangs. The reassignments, the demotions, and the firings have been so vast. This group called Justice Connection has started up to be kind of a one-stop shop for everybody trying to get legal help to protect themselves, employment help, mental health support, security support, because these are prosecutors or agents who went after bad guys and are now no longer beneath the protective shield of the Department of Justice. It speaks to the moment, but Major, there is this destabilized environment right now inside the FBI and the Department of Justice that should not go overlooked.
And it goes straight to morale and the ability to carry out day-to-day functions.
It's hard to chase terrorists, chase bad guys when you're worried every few minutes an email is going to pop up in your inbox that says you're reassigned or you're fired. We've had FBI agents tell us that it's harder to stay focused when this sort of Damocles over your head. Take a listen to more of what this Justice Connection leader, Stacey Young, had to say about the people who are reaching out to her. You've helped hundreds of Justice Department employees. They scared?
They're terrified. They're being terrorized by this administration. They're terrified about their careers. Many are terrified about their safety, and they're terrified about the institution they serve.
What concerns them about their safety, their personal safety?
Their personal safety. For a long time now, DOJ employees have been doxxed online, they've been harassed, and those instances have increased.
The Trump administration has argued they're moving out people who they don't believe can move forward the Trump administration's priorities for this agency, and they have defended so many of these personnel moves.
Is the administration at all on the case of those who are intimidating, doxing, terrorizing these employees? Because those sound like borderline criminal offenses.
Yeah, and not even borderline, right? I mean, doxing and harassment is very much a criminal offense in so many cases. And I think to be deferential to all involved, those who are being victimized by this is an equal opportunity menacing that's been going on. People will easily point to all different peoples on different part of the spectrum who've been the subject to doxing and harassment. It needs to be
across the political spectrum.
Across the political spectrum and across the government in different agencies, not just the Department of Justice. But let me focus on two removals in particular that have caught the attention of the workforce and maybe not so much menacing as demoralizing. The longtime longtime veteran FBI agent who's been the head of the New York field office was, he says, forced to retire. He had defended all those FBI agents and employees who were listed as having been part of the January 6th investigation. And the head of the pardon attorney's office also out.
Scott McFarland, keep on it. Thank you very much. The Palestinian activist who helped lead Columbia University student encampment last year will remain in federal immigration custody in Louisiana. Today, a Manhattan federal judge did not rule on Mahmoud Khalil's request to be moved closer to his home in New York. The judge did, however, allow Khalil's lawyers to have at least 2 phone calls a day with their client. I want to bring in CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman, who was in the courtroom today. Katrina, this involves someone who has green card status, legal permanent resident of this country, and faces deportation via an edict from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. How did that influence the conversation and the legal dynamic in the courtroom today?
Major, it's great to join you. The real issue that was discussed in court today as a threshold one was jurisdiction, where this should even be heard, because the government says that the Southern District of New York is not the correct forum for this. They claim that either it should be in New Jersey or in Louisiana. Mahmoud Khalil is currently in an ICE detention center in Louisiana that he was transferred to. I've been told it's also notorious for its abuses of immigrants who are detained there. And he was briefly, after his arrest in New York, brought to New Jersey. And apparently that's where he was when his lawyers filed their habeas petition for his release. That was at 4:40 a.m., the morning that he was arrested. So a real question is going to be, does this judge have jurisdiction here?
So it sounds, Katrina, like we really didn't get to the nuts and bolts legal arguments here. Is this a free speech matter? Does the government need to call Khalil a criminal, or at least allege some underlying crime other than organizing protests? It's still about where those arguments will be heard, not that they occurred themselves. Is that right?
Major, you're absolutely right. And twice in court today, in fact, the judge gave them an option. He said, do you want to discuss the merits of this case? And the sides did not take him up on it. But I did actually just obtain a government filing that says the basis on which they want to remove Mahmoud Khalil, which we had heard was likely. And that is this provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act that says the Secretary of State has the right to remove someone if they believe that their presence or activities in the United States are adverse to U.S. foreign policy. So this is the reason that they are giving, Major.
Katrina Kaufman with that legal information and perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As job cuts sweep the Department of Education, we speak to the head of the union that represents workers employed there. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. The Department of Education's Washington and regional offices are closed today. But when they reopen, employees coming back to work, well, many of them will be returning for just a little more than a week. More than 1,000 are being placed on leave beginning March 21st. Sharia Smith joins me now. She is the president of the American Federation of Government Employees Local 252, represents employees of the Department of Education. Sharia, it's great to have you with us. 2 questions. How are your employees doing, and what are their jobs now that they're not going to have in the not too distant future?
Yeah. We have not been doing well. We haven't been doing well since January 21st, even though my colleagues and I really wanted to work with this administration, as we have worked with previous administrations, including the first Trump administration. We have not been allowed to. And yesterday, for 969 of us, well, at least the non-managers, we have officially received notice that we cannot work for the American public through the U.S. Department of Education starting in June. And this is just another blip on a reign of terror on the American people and the federal workforce in this administration. And it's extremely unprofessional and extremely cruel.
Do you have legal recourse?
Yeah, of course we do. And I'm a lawyer by trade. I was a litigator before. What we've learned from the previous terminations and changes in working conditions is that this has been unfairly borne by women and employees of color. And women and employees of color were disproportionately placed on administrative leave for roles they did not perform for alleged DEI activity starting in January. And we're now analyzing the numbers and the characteristics of those who have been laid off yesterday to see if we have other concerning trends. But as a litigator, we recognize that lawsuits are not immediate. You file a lawsuit and it takes years. We've had to unfortunately file lawsuits against the first Trump administration when they acted illegally, and we did not receive recourse for some time. So we're absolutely analyzing the data that we have. We just received this information yesterday to avail ourselves of the best recourse. But one of the things that everyone can do, your viewers can do today, is let their members of Congress and senators know that this behavior is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to disrupt the services that they receive without so much of a plan to continue it. It is unacceptable to fire almost half of a workforce for doing their job without any explanation of how the work that we've tried to perform, that we performed in the last administration and the last Trump administration, how it's going to continue. Completely irresponsible and illegal.
The president, as you know, Sharia, says frequently that he wants education to go back to the states. You know as well as I do, probably better, that states have the largest budget allocation for education, K through 12. What mostly the Federal Department of Education does is deal with Pell Grants, student loans, special education funding that goes to the state, and Title I funding to underserved schools across the country. What are your employees who are affected by these termination notices? Are they involved in all of those various tasks, and
Absolutely.
will those services suffer as a result?
Yes, they are all involved, and all those services suffer. I'm not just a lawyer. I'm a former teacher in the state of Texas. And when I taught in the classroom, everything, my curriculum, the test I administered to my students was dictated by by the state of Texas. And it is extremely frustrating to hear people in the highest office blame my colleagues and I for low test scores and curriculum when that is not what we do. And then in the same breath say that those things need to be returned to the states. They are intentionally misguiding the American public. Those things are already with the state. When they are trying to eliminate our agency, what they are eliminating is oversight and additional funding to the states. They want the same states that they are saying have low test scores and have terrible curriculum to now operate without any oversight. That sounds extremely problematic to me. And when we've talked to detractors of the U.S. Department of Education, like the congressman in the 26th District of Texas, their staff members, when we've asked those questions, I think that are very viable, they've conveniently got off camera.
Sharia Smith, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are learning about dozens of new measles cases around the country, as this worsening outbreak draws new attention to Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his talk of, quote, alternatives, unquote, to the measles vaccine. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Measles is spreading across the country, and public health officials are becoming alarmed. Health officials are reporting cases of the highly infectious disease in more than a dozen states, including Georgia, Maryland, California, and Florida. New Jersey has also confirmed a total of 3 new cases, which, under CDC guidelines, constitutes an outbreak. But the most extensive outbreak is concentrated in the Southwest. 223 people in Texas, mostly West Texas, have been infected with measles. Officials have also recorded 33 cases in New Mexico. Omar Villafranca joins us from Dallas. Omar, what is it that Texas health officials are doing and saying about this situation?
Well, Major, they're really working with the local doctors on the ground to give them the information and vaccines, if they can be used with the community, to administer them. Listen, this outbreak is starting in a small Mennonite community in Gaines County, Texas, in West Texas. You mentioned 223 cases. 156 of those cases are in Gaines County. The Mennonite community is several thousand, and they are a small Christian group. They are unvaccinated. They're wary of Western medicine. So one of the doctors who I was talking to there says he treats some of those patients and he tries to get them to get the vaccine. They're just not going to do it.
What about RFK Jr., the HHS secretary? His comments about this in general, and how are they being received by doctors nearest to the outbreak?
Well, listen, I can tell you I've talked to several doctors who are treating patients on the front line. One, when he was in the Oval Office and said that of the 20-plus patients who were in the hospital that they were quarantining, Dr. Laura Johnson at Lubbock Covenant flat out told me that is wrong. That is incorrect. Now, I asked Dr. Wendell Parkey, who's in Seminole, Texas, there in Gaines County. This is what he had to tell me when I brought up RFK.
We were talking about RFK, or Secretary Kennedy, and he's mentioned steroids and vitamin A.
I think it may help, but it doesn't cure it. The MMR, the old vaccines are very well researched. We know that they're safe. And there's other thing, you can't be taking vitamin A forever. You take too much of it, it's bad for your bones.
Talking to Dr. Parkey, he told me it's a dance he has to do. It's a fine line he has to do. Does he want them to take the vaccine? Yes, but they're not going to do it. He wants to inoculate them, but he doesn't want to isolate them. He wants them still coming in for treatment, and that's his dance out there in West Texas as this spreads. And keep in mind, one more thing I want to add. The state updates the numbers every 2 weeks. When we see it grow by 20 or 30, most of the cases are there in Gaines County with that Mennonite community.
Omar Villafranca in Dallas, thank you very, very much. I want to bring in CBS News Chief Medical Correspondent John LaPook now for more on all of this. Dr. LaPook, again, we had a conversation about 10 days ago. We don't want to alarm people, but we don't want to withhold potentially bad information. So how bad could this get?
Well, you know, it's bad for the person who's unvaccinated, who gets very sick, gets hospitalized, or we've seen could even die. So right now, in terms of people who are out there and being, wondering, how's this going to affect me? If you're vaccinated, or if you've had measles, if you've had 2 doses of vaccine, you're going to be okay. You're protected. But in terms of how bad it could get, it's in these pockets all around the country where you have areas where you're not getting vaccinated, hesitancy. And that's really the problem. And also the fact that it's a 10 to 14-day incubation period means that every time you see an outbreak, we're hearing somebody was in an airport, somebody was in a hair salon, somebody was in a supermarket. Well, they can have no symptoms. In fact, you could be shedding the virus and infecting people. It's so infectious 4 days before you even get a rash. And that's why you have it traveling along and ricocheting around the United States. And so we don't know where this is going to end. I mean, the end of the day, it's the vaccination that really is going to stop the spread.
And I've heard mention, Dr. LaPook, of boosters. Who should think about a booster? What is its utility? And how do I think about whether I should or shouldn't get one?
All right, I'm an internist, too. I internist in gastroenterology, so I'm getting this all the time. I'm going to actually, even if it takes a little time, let's slowly explain this because people are really confused. CDC says if you were born, before 1957, the odds are that you got the measles. And if you got the measles, then you're immune forever. If you know that you got the measles, you're done. Now, from 1958 to 1968, that's the tricky period. If you were born after 1957, then from 58 until 63, which is when the vaccine came out, we see the graphic up there, dramatic drop in measles. But what if you were born in 1958, 59, 60, 61, 62, and you didn't get that vaccine? We don't know whether or not you got measles or not. So if you don't remember whether you got the measles, that's a period where you probably should go ahead and get a booster because you don't know. If you got the measles, you know you have a record, or your mother told you, if she remembers, you're fine. Now, trickiest is 63 to 68. Why is it so tricky? The vaccine came out, and some people got the much more effective attenuated virus. That's it's live, but it's weakened. And some got the much more ineffective, the much less effective dead, killed virus. You probably don't have the records of that. So if you got vaccinated 63 to 68, you don't know which one you got. And you might as well, if you don't have your records, you could do one of two things. You could just go ahead and get boosted, which is what the CDC says. Look, you know, it's actually no big deal. There's no downside to getting just a booster if you're not sure. Or you can check your titers, your blood test, and see, are there antibodies to the measles? So it's a little bit of a tricky answer, but that's it.
But basically, if you're in doubt, it's okay to get a booster.
You can get a booster twice, yeah. You can get
Robert F. Kennedy
vaccination
Jr.
twice.
has talked recently about vaccines, meaning the measles vaccine, undercutting natural immunity within mothers, and this being part of the conversation or something that should be more a part of the conversation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, you know, if you pull out the microscope and look at the big picture, what's so important in public health and in your job is you don't want to bury the lead, okay?
No.
The lead here is that if you look at, say, the about 20 kids who are hospitalized, in Texas, all 20 of them were unvaccinated. We crunched the numbers this afternoon with our team, and it turns out that in the people who you know whether they were vaccinated or unvaccinated, about 95% of the people who got measles were unvaccinated. So that's number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We know that the people who are getting measles were unvaccinated. We also know that if you get 2 doses, you have 97% lifetime immunity. 1 dose gives you about 93%. So, yes, there is some maternal antibody that crosses the placenta and can protect the child for several months, 3, 4, 5 months. You can't rely on that. That's why they don't give the vaccine until 12 months, because it's less effective if you've got these antibodies from the mother that are gobbling up the vaccine, right? So you wait. In terms of the immunity wearing off over time, yes, you can find some studies. You can cherry pick and find that the antibody titers can go down in some people over time. But at the end of the day, you have these memory B and T cells, these immune cells, that even if your levels, you can't quite detect them high enough in terms of the standards, when you see the measles, they spring into action and they give you protection. So that's why they get the 97% lifetime protection if you have both doses. So again, communicating public health data is really tricky. You have to do it in the certain order. The most important thing that you say in a story, right, Major? It's the first thing you say. The second, what's the second most thing that you say? The second most important thing. And so I think, one of the issues that my colleagues have with the advice that we're hearing from government right now and from RFK Jr. is, these are tricky things to communicate. I don't doubt his intentions, but every word is important. And when you say, well, some people it wears off, what do you mean some people? How many people? Give me the numbers. Give me the evidence.
Right.
We're talking about evidence-based medicine, and I think it's really important. I think it's important to have people who are trained in science and trained in communication to do this public health communication, because it's tricky, even with people with the best intentions.
It's tricky, but not for Dr. John LaPook. Doctor, always. Thank you very, very much.
Take care.
House spending bill is facing Senate Democratic opposition, at least so far, with a shutdown just 2 days away. But Elon Musk, you've heard of him, he might just be rooting for a government closure of a few days, maybe longer. We'll tell you why right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. In just over 48 hours, the federal government will partially shut down unless Congress can pass a spending bill. Now, I know you've heard that story before. Shutdown stories are kind of circular in Washington. They come and go. What you haven't heard, though, is what we're going to talk about now. New reporting from Wired finds that Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency just might want Washington to close down for a few days. McKenna Kelly and Victoria Elliott have both been covering Elon Musk and Doge for Wired. Let's see. McKenna is in Zoom, and Victoria is on our Studio 57 in New York. So, McKenna, talk to me about, no, Victoria, forgive me. Checking my notes here. Just check your notes, Major. Victoria, tell me about Elon Musk, Doge, and their underlying interests, though not spoken out loud, in favor of a partial government shutdown.
Yeah, so I think, when we're talking about a shutdown, the fundamentals of a shutdown means that every agency has to go through the people that work for it and categorize them as essential or non-essential. And the narrow definition for essential is really like protecting people's lives or property. So, air traffic controllers, for instance, not going to be paused in a shutdown, but things like maybe food inspection, that could be the type of role that might be paused during a shutdown. And I think this really aligns with what DOGE has been trying to do, which is mass government layoffs. We've already seen them coming into agencies like USAID, like what they've tried to do with the CFPB. And really what we're seeing here with the government shutdown was this would be a very expedient way to sort of push more people out of the government, especially in a longer shutdown where maybe even if you can't fire people because they're furloughed, people have to pay rent, people have to feed their kids. If a shutdown goes on for too long, that can be a way to force people to resign.
Even though President Trump has said he doesn't want to shut down, Musk hasn't said anything really publicly about this. So this is something that if it happens, it'd be okay with him, I guess.
Well, so reporting from myself, Leah Feiger, and Jake LaHoot found that, in closed-door meetings, it seems quite clear that Musk is pro-shutdown, even as Trump and maybe other Republicans are trying to keep the government open. I think the bigger thing, too, is, federal employees that I spoke to for weeks have been concerned about a possible shutdown and the way that that could sort of further what DOGE has been trying to do in either forcing employees to resign or pushing them out of the government via reduction in force or RIF. And again, forcing agencies to categorize people into who's essential and who's not, which is already something that the administration has been trying to push agencies to do. When you're looking at a shutdown, it's much more austere. So that's sort of the bare bones that can keep anything running. And even that kind of work, could be something that could be useful to DOGE in the future.
McKenna, you have reporting on DOGE and a chatbot. Is that something that DOGE imagines can replace federal workers, chatbots?
Yeah, so a lot of the leadership at the General Services Administration, which is the agency leading this effort, or accelerating it, I should say, there is this chatbot called GSAI, very clever name, that essentially the Biden administration people at GSA had been working on for several months prior to the inauguration. But this was one of the products that Stephen Ehekian, TTS director Thomas Shedd, they saw this in the GSA portfolio. And they said, oh, this is something we really like. This is something that DOGE will probably like. So they accelerated the adoption of it. And as of last week, about 1,500 employees at GSA are now using it. The interface is very similar to ChatGPT, to other AI products that we're used to using every day, where we ask it a simple question and it delivers us some kind of response. And so I think the thought is, going into what could be a possible government shutdown, or, continued RIFs, continued firings would be, if we have less heads, let's try and replace them, or at least make the employees that we continue to employ more efficient, with the use of this chatbot.
And also using other AI tools, again, to reduce the size of the workforce and possibly speed things up, if possible.
Correct. A couple of weeks ago, I reported about how DOGE was currently talking to folks at the Defense Department trying to get a copy of this software called AutoRIF. The Defense Department started this software and started building it back in the 90s, I believe, and it has been continually updated. And it's one of these products that you can input some data about the government workforce, and it'll shoot out like a template for how to conduct a RIF. So the DOGE folks are definitely using whatever AI-related efficiency tools in order to get their goals accomplished.
And RIF is not a quick-witted speech. It is reduction in force. McKenna Kelly and Victoria Elliott from Wired, thank you very, very much. She advanced diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at her prestigious university. Now, her son-in-law wants to end it across the country. Next, a CBS News investigation into the divide, the DEI divide, inside Vice President J.D. Vance's family.
We've ended the tyranny of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion policies all across the entire federal government and indeed the private sector and our military.
Welcome back. The Trump administration has been nothing if not steadfast in its opposition to diversity, equity, and inclusion. CBS News investigation, however, finds that those anti-DEI positions are in conflict with the work done by Vice President Vance's mother-in-law. I want to bring in CBS News investigative reporter Graham Cates for more on his reporting. Graham, what have you found out?
Sure. So J.D. Vance's mother-in-law is in her own right a public figure. She's the provost of one of the colleges at the University of California, San Diego. And she's really been a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion at the university. She helped create a pilot course on race, ethnicity, and gender in biology and medicine. It's a course that's still offered today, almost a decade later. She served on the university's Biological Sciences Diversity Committee, and she's kind of written proudly of her school's commitment to diversity. A letter on the About page of the college where she's a provost says that she wrote that there's an opportunity and responsibility to address systemic racism. She says specifically anti-Blackness and anti-Asian racism. And as you mentioned, that kind of, it doesn't jibe with really some of the marquee achievements of the White House in terms of trying to pare back DEI across sectors and across the country.
And Graham, this is not a scandal, but it is interesting because those in the Trump universe refer to diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives as basically racist. And yet J.D. Vance's mother-in-law not only advocates, but proudly advocates on the benefits to be derived educationally and otherwise from those very initiatives.
Yeah, and we asked the vice president about this, and he said that this is no different than what a lot of Americans experience when there's a person in their family who maybe has a disagreement with them on something politics. He said his approach is just to get over it, and that he still loves his mother-in-law and really values his parents-in-law and their relationship with his children. And he spoke adoringly about her previously, too.
Of course, that's not the point of the inquiry, whether you love your mother-in-law or not. That's a completely separate issue. It's just, do you have anything that you've learned through your mother-in-law about these particular initiatives of which she is obviously so publicly supportive of?
Sure, and we put that question to him, and we didn't get a response directly to that. But since the very beginning of his political career, I mean, right when he first started running for Senate in 2021, his advocacy against DEI has been one of the main focuses of his speeches, of his campaigning. He early on quoted Richard Nixon saying professors are the enemy, and said that universities need to be attacked for their support of DEI.
Maybe just not his mother-in-law. We'll find out. Graham Cates, thank you very much for that reporting. Appreciate it. It is a tradition that began in 1953 under President Dwight David Eisenhower. Ireland's Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, coming to visit the White House to mark St. Patrick's Day. Now, of course, St. Patrick's Day is Monday, but today President Trump hosted the country's current leader, who also attended a breakfast with Vice President Vance and made a lunch stop at the Capitol. Vance wore shamrock-themed socks, but President Trump stuck to his very, very much familiar signature red tie. Now, over the years, the luck of the Irish has been on show in Washington on St. Patrick's Day and the days around it, like today. From President Bush accepting the annual shamrock to former Speaker Paul Ryan donning a neon green tie and holding his Guinness securely aloft while making a toast to Nancy Pelosi festooned in green pearls. Throughout history, it's been a day in Washington when everyone, it seems, has just a little bit of Irish in them. That does it for today. I'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.